October 21st, 1805, off Cape Trafalgar on the southwest coast of Spain. Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve commands the combined fleet of France and Spain, 33 ships of the line, the largest wooden warships ever built. Among them, the Santissima Trinidad, a floating fortress of 4 gun decks and around 140 cannon. Facing them, outnumbered, are 27 British ships under Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, the most dangerous sailor alive. Flying one last order down the line, England expects that every man will do his duty. Whoever wins this morning decides whether Napoleon can ever cross the Channel and whether Britain rules the world's oceans for the next 100 years. Both sides know it. But let's change one thing. Cutting through those same gray Atlantic swells, riding no wind at all and showing no sail, is an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer of the United States Navy. 9,000 tons of steel and computing power from the 21st century, with a radar that maps the whole battle before any lookout can see a thing, and missiles that strike from miles beyond the range of any cannon ever cast. So what if the most produced warship of the modern age dropped into the most famous naval battle in history? Let's see what just appeared off Cape Trafalgar. The Arleigh Burke is not a warship in any sense Nelson's captains would recognize, and that is before it fires a single round. It carries no sail and no oar. It runs on 4 gas turbine engines, the same family that powers an airliner, generating enough power to drive 9,000 tons of steel past 30 knots, faster than any ship at Trafalgar could manage in a perfect wind, and it does it in any direction it likes, no matter where the wind is blowing. To a sailor whose entire trade is reading the wind, a ship that ignores the wind completely is not simply a faster ship. It is a different kind of thing. At the heart of it sits the Aegis combat system and the SPI phased array radar, which tracks hundreds of contacts at once, across the horizon and beyond it, in fog, in darkness, in driving rain. In 1805, where finding the enemy means a boy at the masthead with a telescope, the Burke sees the whole battle laid out as a map of labeled targets, while every captain in both fleets is still squinting for sails at the gray edge of the world. What it carries makes the radar almost beside the point. More than 90 vertical launch cells with a menu for every situation. Tomahawk cruise missiles that fly themselves to targets 1,000 miles away. SM-6 missiles that reach threats more than 150 miles off. And evolved Sea Sparrow missiles for anything that gets close. On the bow sits a 5-inch gun that fires around 20 rounds a minute and reaches targets more than a dozen miles out. And beside the superstructure waits a phalanx gun that throws thousands of rounds a minute as a last word. In 1805, the Arleigh Burke is not just the most dangerous ship at Trafalgar. It is the most dangerous thing that has ever floated on any ocean in human history. But Britain did not come to rule the seas by accident, and Nelson did not become a legend by beating weak men. The Royal Navy of 1805 is the most professional fighting force on the planet. Its gun crews drilled until they can fire 3 broadsides in the time it takes the enemy to manage 2. The combined fleet they face is no rabble either. The Santissima Trinidad and her sisters are the largest, most heavily armed machines of their age. Oak fortresses carrying over 100 guns and 1,000 men apiece. And Nelson is about to do something audacious enough to be remembered for centuries. Instead of fighting the textbook parallel line, he splits his fleet into 2 columns and drives them straight through the enemy formation, cutting it to pieces so his gunners can rake the French and Spanish ships from bow to stern. These are the finest sailors of their century, led by one of the great commanders in all of history, with thousands of men and the courage to match. They have every quality a fighting fleet can have, except a single framework for what is about to happen to them. The battle. It begins in the gray hour before the fleets have even closed to gunnery range. The Burke runs dark, radar sweeping, and the SPY array paints the entire field across miles of open water without a soul on either side knowing it is there. Every ship of the line, every frigate, every flagship appears on the combat display as a labeled target. The crew sets priorities. The command ships first, Villeneuve's flagship Bucentaure and the towering Santissima Trinidad, then the heaviest of the line. There is one problem nobody planned for. GPS does not exist in 1805. The satellites a Tomahawk normally leans on for precision navigation will not be launched for another 2 centuries. So the crew switches to inertial guidance. The missile tracks its own movement through space with gyroscopes and accelerometers, calculating its position from the instant it leaves the cell. It is older, blunter technology. Against targets the size of a first-rate ship of the line at these ranges, it is far more than enough. The first Tomahawk leaves the deck at a whisper, drops low over the swell, and accelerates away into the dawn on nothing but its own internal mathematics. No warning, no arc across the sky a lookout could call out, no enemy ship anywhere in sight. The 1,000-pound warhead strikes the Bucentaur amidships, and the flagship of the combined fleet comes apart in a column of fire that lights the sea for miles. On the wooden decks all around, this produces something no admiral in 1805 has ever had to face: an attack with no source. There is no enemy sail to aim at, no powder smoke on the horizon, nothing to return fire against. A flagship simply ceased to exist. Officers who have stood their ground through hours of broadside fire are looking at one another with no order to give, because no manual ever written has a page for this. And a few miles off, aboard HMS Victory, Nelson and his own officers are watching the same impossible thing through their telescopes. The enemy flagship gone in a heartbeat, with no British ship within a mile of it. For once in his life, the great admiral has no order to give either. He came to Trafalgar expecting the hardest fight of his career, and instead he is a spectator at the end of an age, not yet certain whose side the silent gray ship is even on. A second missile follows, and a third. The Santissima Trinidad, the largest warship in the world, takes a hit that no amount of oak was ever built to absorb. The command structure of the combined fleet collapses in minutes. The captains who survive do exactly the right thing, and it does not matter. A cluster of French ships claws around to put the wind behind them and close on the direction they think the fire is coming from. It is the correct instinct. It is the wrong century. The Burke simply turns at 30 knots, slides a few miles across the water, and their charge arrives at empty sea. From a French or Spanish deck, the picture is pure nightmare. There is no enemy to fight, only the ocean erasing your fleet one ship at a time, from a direction that keeps changing. Men who trained their whole lives for the roar and smoke of a close action are lowering boats, throwing themselves into the swell, swimming for anything that still floats. Whole crews strike their colors and surrender to an enemy they have never once laid eyes on, because there is nothing else left to do. As the light comes up and gray separates from the swell, the full picture becomes visible for the first time. The line that Villeneuve spent the dawn forming is gone, scattered into burning, drifting clusters. The Burke closes to gun range, and the 5-inch opens up on the densest knots of ships. A medieval-built ship of the line is not a hardened target. It is oak, hemp, canvas, and crowded decks of men, and a 5-inch shell does not need pinpoint precision to be catastrophic. Airburst rounds detonate over the decks. Rigging comes down in heaps, hulls split at the waterline. And the oldest reflex in naval warfare, to close up and present a united front, works against them, because to a modern fire control system, a tight cluster of ships is simply a better target than a scattered one. The discipline that made the Royal Navy and its rivals the masters of the age is now helping to end them faster. They are doing everything right. It is just the wrong enemy. But let's be honest, all of that is the perfect case scenario. Now the limitations. The first one is not ammunition, because Trafalgar is roughly 60 ships, not thousands, and the Burke has more than enough missiles and shells to deal with 60. The first real problem is telling friend from enemy. British, French, and Spanish ships of the line all look broadly the same through a periscope or on a radar return, wooden 3-deckers under sail, and the destroyer that wants to spare Nelson's fleet has to be certain which clusters are which before it fires. The second is proximity. Medieval-era cannon cannot scratch a steel hull, but a destroyer threading through a burning maze of crippled ships, some still crewed, some with powder magazines ready to cook off, is not operating in a risk-free space, and the oldest threat at sea still applies. If it ever let itself get surrounded at point-blank range, hundreds of boarders with cutlasses would be a genuine problem for a crew of around 300. The Burke wins by never allowing that, by owning the range and the speed and refusing the close fight. And the last limitation is the largest. The destroyer is alone, and Trafalgar is a battle inside a much bigger war. It can erase the combined fleet in a morning, but it cannot land an army. It cannot march on Paris, and it cannot touch Napoleon, who rules most of Europe by land, and will keep ruling it for another 10 years. A single destroyer can hand Britain the sea in one morning. It cannot hand her the war. Waterloo is still 10 years and 100,000 lives away, and it will be settled by armies on land that the Burke never fires a single shot at. The ship answers the naval question completely. The land question it cannot touch at all. When the smoke clears off Cape Trafalgar, the combined fleet of two empires is wreckage and drifting spars across miles of water, and not one British ship has been lost. But here is the strange part. The result is the one history already wrote. Britain was always going to win Trafalgar. Nelson's real victory ended the invasion threat and secured the oceans for a century just as completely as the destroyer does. What changes is the cost and the legend. Because the battle is over before the fleets ever grind together at musket range, the French sharpshooter in the rigging of the Redoutable never finds his target, and Nelson, who in our history is shot through the spine and dies below decks at the very moment of his triumph, this time lives to walk his quarterdeck and watch an iron ship with no sails win his battle for him. There is no Nelson's column. There is no dying admiral whispering that he has done his duty. Instead, the survivors carry home something far stranger. Stories of a mastless gray ship that moved against the wind, that struck with thunder and no smoke from beyond the edge of sight, and then was simply gone. The chaplains will call it a judgment. The sailors will call it a sea devil. And the deeper truth, the one none of them can see, is that every navy on Earth was about to spend the next 100 years building bigger and bigger wooden ships, and a single visitor from the future just showed all of them, in one morning, that the entire age of sail was already over. They would argue about the iron ghost of Trafalgar for generations, and no one in any century would ever fully explain it.